Small towns are supposed to feel safe. One main road, familiar faces, police who know everyone by name. But what happens when the people meant to protect you are the reason no one asks questions? Tonight on Dark Hours, we're diving into 5 small-town cops' horror stories. Cases where flashing lights didn't mean help was coming, and authority became something far more unsettling. If you're new here, subscribe to Dark Hours for true horror and real-life stories best told after dark. And tell me in the comments, are you watching from a small town or a big city tonight? Now dim the lights, and let's begin. The first time I pulled myself over, I thought I was having a breakdown, and my name is Carter Bellamy, and I need you to understand that I was sober and clear-headed when it happened, because otherwise none of this makes sense. And I was driving patrol on Highway 12 outside of Vesper Falls, which is a town in northern Minnesota with a population of 412 people, and I had been an officer there for 3 months, and it was 2:15 in the morning on a Tuesday, and the road was empty, like it always was. And I saw headlights coming toward me, and I did not think anything of it until the vehicle passed. And I saw that it was a Vesper Falls patrol car identical to mine. And I radioed dispatch and said, "This is Unit 3. Did we get a new vehicle?" And dispatch was silent for a long time. And then the voice came back, and it was Jenny, who worked nights. And she said, "Carter, you are the only unit on duty tonight." And I said, "I just passed another patrol car heading south on 12. And she said, "That is not possible." And I said, "I know what I saw." And she said, "Come back to the station." And I turned around and drove back. And when I walked into the station, Jenny was standing at the dispatch desk, and she looked scared. And she said, "Carter, how much sleep have you been getting?" And I said, "Enough." And she said, "Are you sure you saw another patrol car?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Chief Grady needs to talk to you." And I went into his office, and Chief Grady was sitting at his desk. And he was a man in his 60s with white hair and a face like old leather. And he said, "Sit down, Carter." And I sat. And he said, "Tell me exactly what you saw." And I told him, and he listened. And when I finished, he said, "You are not the first." And I said, "What?" And he said, "You are not the first officer to see themselves on patrol." I thought he was messing with me, but his face was serious, and I said, "What do you mean, see myself?" And he said exactly what it sounds like. And he opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. And inside were reports going back 30 years. And every single one of them was from an officer in Vesper Falls who reported seeing another version of themselves on patrol. And I read through them, and my hands started shaking because the descriptions were all the same. And every officer reported passing a patrol car that looked identical to theirs, and some of them said they saw the other driver, and it looked exactly like them. And I looked up at Chief Grady and said, "What is this?" And he said, "Vesper Falls has a problem." And I said, "What kind of problem?" And he said, "The town makes copies." And I said, "Copies of what?" And he said, "Copies of us." And I said, "That is impossible." And he said, "I thought so too, until I saw myself standing in my own backyard 20 years ago, and I stared at him and said, 'You saw yourself?' And he nodded and said, 'I was taking out the trash.' And I looked over the fence, and I was standing there in my uniform just staring at me. And I called out, and it turned and walked away, and I chased it, but it was gone. And I said, 'What do you mean it?' And he said, 'Because it was not me, Carter, it was something wearing my face.' And I asked what it wanted, and he said, 'We do not know, but every officer who has seen their copy has disappeared within 6 months.' And I felt my stomach drop, and I said, 'What?' And he said, 'Every single one of them.' And he pointed to the reports, and I saw the names. And next to each name was a date, and the word missing, and I counted. And there were 14 of them. And I said, 'Where did they go?' And Chief Grady said, 'We think they were replaced.' I did not sleep that night, and I sat in my apartment with the lights on, and I kept looking out the window expecting to see myself standing in the parking lot. And the next day I went back to the station, and I pulled the personnel files, and I looked at the history of the Vesper Falls Police Department, and I saw that the turnover rate was higher than any department I had ever seen, and officers would work for a few months or a year, and then they would be listed as terminated or resigned. And I asked Chief Grady about it, and he said most of them did not resign. "Carter, they just stopped coming to work." And I said, "Did anyone look for them?" And he said, "We tried, but they were gone, and their families said they left town and their apartments were empty, and it was like they never existed." And I said, "What about their families?" And he said, "The families left too." And I said, "All of them." And he nodded. And I said, "This does not make sense." And he said, "Nothing about Vesper Falls makes sense." And I asked why he stayed, and he said, "Because I have nowhere else to go, and because if I leave, then whoever replaces me will end up just like the others." And I said, "You are staying to protect people." And he said, "I am staying because I do not have a choice." And I realized he was trapped, just like I was about to be. I started seeing my copy more after that, and it was always at night and always on patrol. And sometimes I would pass it on the highway, and sometimes I would see it parked outside the gas station or the diner. And once I saw it standing on the side of the road just watching me drive by, and I would radio dispatch every time, and Jenny would say, "Carter, you need to stop." And I said, "I am not crazy." And she said, "I know you are not. But talking about it makes it worse." And I said, "Makes what worse?" And she said, "It makes the copy stronger." And I said, "What does that mean?" And she said, "The more you acknowledge it, the more real it becomes." And I said, "It is already real." And she said, "No, Carter, it is becoming real. And there is a difference." And I did not understand, but I stopped radioing dispatch, and I stopped talking about it, and I tried to pretend it was not happening. But every night, I would see it, and every night, it would get closer. And one night, I was parked outside the grocery store, and I saw the other patrol car pull up beside me, and I looked over and I saw myself sitting in the driver's seat, and it was wearing my uniform and my badge. And it turned and looked at me and smiled, and I felt my blood turn cold because the smile was wrong and it was too wide, and the eyes were empty. And I got out of my car, and I walked over and I knocked on the window, and it rolled down, and I said, "Who are you?" And it said, "I am Carter Bellamy." And I said, "No, you are not." And it said, "Yes, I am." And it held up a badge, and it was identical to mine, same number, same name. And I said, "Where did you get that?" And it said, "I have always had it." And I reached for my gun, and it reached for its gun, and we stared at each other, and then it said, "You should go home. Carter, you look tired." And it rolled up the window and drove away, and I stood there shaking, and I did not know what to do. I went to Chief Grady the next morning, and I said it talked to me, and he said, "What did it say?" And I told him, and he closed his eyes and said, "You do not have much time." And I said, "Time for what?" And he said, "Time before it takes your place." And I said, "How does it do that?" And he said, "We do not know, but the officers who disappeared were last seen talking to their copies, and then a few days later they stopped showing up for work, and when we checked their homes, they were gone, and the only thing left was their uniform folded on the bed." And I said, "What about fingerprints or DNA?" And he said, "We checked, and the copies do not leave fingerprints, and they do not have DNA." And I said, "That is impossible." And he said, "Impossible does not mean anything in Vesper Falls." And I asked if there was a way to stop it, and he said, "If there was, we would have found it by now." And I said, "So I am just supposed to wait until it takes me?" And he said, "No, Carter, you are supposed to run, but I know you will not, because no one ever does." And I said, "Why not?" And he said, "Because by the time you realize you should run, it is already too late. And you start to think maybe it would be better if the copy took over, because at least then you could rest." And I said I would never think that. And he said, "Give it a few weeks." I started losing time after that, and I would be driving, and then I would blink, and I would be somewhere else, and I would not remember how I got there. And once I woke up in my patrol car outside my own apartment, and I did not remember driving home. And my uniform was dirty, and there was mud on my boots, and I did not know where it came from. And I started keeping a journal to track my days, and I would write down everything I did, and every place I went, and I would check it every morning to make sure I was not missing anything, but there were gaps, and there were hours I could not account for. And I started to think that maybe the copy was not just watching me. Maybe it was living parts of my life when I was not paying attention. And one night I was at the station and I saw my handwriting in the logbook, but I did not remember writing it. And I asked Jenny if I had been in earlier, and she said yes. "You came in around 3 and filed a report." And I said, "I do not remember that." And she looked at me and said, "Carter, you need to leave Vesper Falls." And I said, "I cannot." And she said, "Why not?" And I said, "Because I do not think I'm allowed to anymore." And she said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "I tried to leave yesterday, and I got in my car and I drove toward the county line, and my car stopped, and I tried to start it and it would not turn over, and I got out and I walked and my legs gave out, and I crawled back to the car and it started immediately, and I drove back into town." And she stared at me and said, "The town is keeping you here." And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Then you do not have much time." I saw my copy every day after that, and it was always closer, and it started showing up at the places I went, and once I went to the diner for lunch, and it was sitting in my usual booth, and it waved at me, and I turned and left. And another time I went home, and it was standing in my living room just looking around, like it was deciding if it liked the place, and I yelled at it to get out. And it looked at me and said, "This will be mine soon." And I said, "Never." And it said, "You do not have a choice, Carter. You are already fading." And I looked down at my hands, and they were translucent, and I could see through them. And I screamed, and I blinked, and they were normal again, and the copy was gone, and I did not know if it had ever been there or if I was losing my mind. And I called Chief Grady, and I said, "I think I am disappearing." And he said, "I know." And I said, "How do you know?" And he said, "Because I saw you today, and you looked like a ghost." And I said, "What do I do?" And he said, "There is nothing you can do. Carter, the town has decided." And I said, "Decided what?" And he said, "Decided that you are done and someone else will take your place." And I said, "I do not want to be replaced." And he said, "None of us do, but it happens anyway." And the line went dead. I stopped going to work because I was afraid that if I put on my uniform, the copy would take it, and I stayed in my apartment with the door locked and the curtains closed, and I did not eat, and I did not sleep, and I just sat there waiting. And on the 5th day, there was a knock on my door, and I looked through the peephole, and I saw myself standing there in uniform, and it said, "Carter, open the door." And I said, "No." And it said, "You cannot stay in there forever." And I said, "Watch me." And it said, "I already have your job, and I already have your badge, and soon I will have your life, and you will be nothing." And I said, "I am not nothing." And it laughed and said, "You are barely anything now." And I looked down at my hands, and they were see-through again, and I could see the bones underneath, and I knew it was right. And I opened the door, and my copy stepped inside, and it looked at me and said, "Thank you." And I said, "For what?" And it said, "For letting go." And I felt myself fading, and the last thing I saw was my copy putting on my jacket and walking out the door, and then I was gone. I do not know where I am now, but I can still see Vesper Falls, and I can see my copy doing my job and living my life, and no one knows the difference, and I am trying to scream, but no one can hear me. And I think this is where all the other officers ended up, and I can see them here too, just faint shapes in the dark, and we are all watching our copies, and we cannot do anything. And I think this is what the town wanted all along. And I think Vesper Falls does not just need cops. It needs something to feed on, and we are what it eats. And if you ever get a job offer from a small town in Minnesota, and the pay seems too good, and the people seem too friendly, you need to say no, because some towns do not hire you, they consume you. I just saw another patrol car pull up outside the station, and a young woman got out, and she looked excited, and Chief Grady shook her hand, and I know what happens next. My name is Anita Ruiz, and I need you to understand that the Gable Creek Police Department does not issue firearms. And when I asked why on my first day, Sergeant Poole said, "Because guns do not work here," and I thought he meant the department could not afford them, but that was not what he meant at all. And Gable Creek is in the mountains of West Virginia, and the population is around 600. And I moved there from Pittsburgh because I wanted to get away from the city, and I thought working in a small town would be safer and quieter. And I was 28, and I had been a cop for 4 years, and I knew how to handle myself. And during my interview, Sergeant Poole asked if I was comfortable working without a firearm, and I said, "I would prefer to have one," and he said, "That is not an option." And I said, "Why not?" And he said, "You will understand soon enough," and I should have walked away, but I needed the job and I took it, and my first week was normal. And I carried a baton and pepper spray and a radio, and I responded to noise complaints and petty theft, and I felt ridiculous without a gun, but I managed. And then I responded to my first real call, and it was a domestic disturbance on Ridgeline Road. And dispatch said the caller reported screaming and possible violence, and I drove out there, and it was a small house at the end of a dirt road, and I parked and I approached the front door, and I could hear shouting inside, and I knocked, and the shouting stopped, and a man opened the door, and he was big, maybe 6'2", and he was drunk and angry, and he said, "What do you want?" And I said, "We got a call about a disturbance." And he said, "There is no disturbance," and I said, "Can I come in and check?" And he said, "No." And he tried to close the door, and I put my foot in the way, and he shoved the door, and it hit my leg, and I stumbled back, and he stepped onto the porch. And I reached for my pepper spray, and he lunged at me, and I sprayed him, and he did not stop, and he grabbed my arm and twisted it, and I fell, and he stood over me, and I thought he was going to kill me. And then he stopped, and he looked behind me, and his face went pale, and he let go and backed away. And I turned, and there was a woman standing there, and she was not dressed like a cop, and she was not dressed like anyone I had ever seen. And her clothes were old, like from 100 years ago. And she was pale, and her eyes were black. And she looked at the man and said, "You need to go inside," and he nodded and went inside and closed the door. And I stood up and I said, "Who are you?" And she looked at me and said, "I am. What keeps you safe?" And I said, "I do not understand." And she said, "You will." And she walked away, and I tried to follow. But she was gone, and I radioed dispatch, and I said there was a woman at the scene. And dispatch said, "We know." And I said, "Who was she?" And dispatch said, "We do not talk about them on the radio." And I went back to the station, and Sergeant Poole was waiting, and he said, "I see you met one of them." And I said, "One of what?" And he said, "One of the things that protect us." And I said, "I do not need protection." And he said, "Yes, you do, because without them, you would be dead." Sergeant Poole took me into his office, and he told me that Gable Creek has a history, and the history is that a long time ago the people who lived in the mountains made a deal with something that lived in the woods, and the deal was that the something would protect the town, and in exchange the town would never use violence against it. And I said, "What does that mean?" And he said, "It means we do not carry guns, because guns are violence, and if we carry them, then the deal is broken." And I said, "That is ridiculous." And he said, "Maybe, but it is also true." And I said, "What is the something?" And he said, "We do not know, but we call them the hollow ones, because they look like people, but they are not." And I said, "The woman I saw looked real." And he said, "They look real until you get close, and then you see that they are not." And I asked what they were. And he said, "We think they are the people who disappeared in the mountains over the years, and something took them and changed them, and now they protect the town, because that is what the deal requires." And I said, "This is insane." And he said, "You are free to leave, Anita, but if you stay, you follow the rules, and the rules are no guns and no violence. And if you break the rules, then the hollow ones will not protect you anymore." And I said, "Protect me from what?" And he said, "From the things that live deeper in the woods." I stayed because I did not have anywhere else to go, and I started seeing the hollow ones more, and they would appear at scenes where things were getting dangerous, and they would just stand there and stare, and the person causing trouble would stop and leave, and it happened over and over. And once I responded to a bar fight, and two men were beating each other bloody, and I could not stop them, and then a hollow one appeared in the doorway, and both men stopped and looked at it, and they left without saying a word. And I asked the bartender if he saw it, and he said yes. And I said, "Does this happen a lot?" And he said, "Yes, every time." And I said, "What are they?" And he said, "They are the price we pay." And I said, "For what?" And he said, "For living here." And I realized that everyone in Gable Creek knew about the hollow ones, and no one questioned it because it was just part of life, and I started to feel like I was the only person who thought it was wrong. I tried to learn more about the hollow ones, and I went to the library and I looked through old newspapers, and I found articles about people who disappeared in the mountains, and there were dozens of them going back over 100 years, and most of them were never found. And I found one article from 1923 about a logger who came back after being missing for 2 weeks, and he said he had been taken by something in the woods, and it had changed him, and he did not feel like himself anymore. And the article said he left town a few days later and was never seen again, and I wondered if he had become one of the hollow ones. And I asked Sergeant Poole, and he said probably. And I said, "How many of them are there?" And he said, "We do not know, but enough." And I asked if they ever hurt anyone, and he said, "Not unless you break the deal." And I said, "What happens if you break the deal?" And he said, "We had an officer try to carry a gun about 10 years ago." And I said, "What happened?" And he said, "The hollow ones stopped protecting him, and something came out of the woods and killed him, and we found his body torn apart." And I said, "What came out of the woods?" And Sergeant Poole said, "We do not know because we do not go into the woods." And I said, "Why not?" And he said, "Because that is where the things live that the hollow ones protect us from." I started having nightmares about the hollow ones, and in the dreams I would be walking through Gable Creek, and everyone I saw was a hollow one, and they would turn and look at me, and their faces would peel away, and underneath was nothing, just darkness. And I would wake up gasping, and I started avoiding them, and I would take different routes, and I would leave scenes before they appeared, but it did not matter because they were always there. And one night I was driving on Ridgeline Road and I saw one standing in the middle of the road, and I slowed down and it did not move, and I stopped the car and I got out and I said move, and it did not move, and I stepped closer and I could see its face and it looked like a woman I had seen in one of the old newspaper articles, and I said, "Are you real?" And it said, "I was once," and I said, "What are you now?" And it said, "I am what I need to be," and I said, "I do not understand." And it said, "You will," and it walked into the woods, and I stood there, shaking. I decided to leave Gable Creek because I could not handle it anymore, and I packed my things and I got in my car and I started driving, and I got about 5 miles outside of town and my car stopped, and I tried to start it and it would not turn over, and I got out and I looked under the hood and there was nothing wrong, and I heard footsteps and I turned and there were 3 hollow ones standing behind me, and one of them said, "You cannot leave," and I said, "Why not?" And it said, "Because you are part of the deal now," and I said, "I did not agree to anything." And it said, "You agreed when you stayed." And I said, "I want out." And it said, "There is no out." And I asked what would happen if I walked, and it said, "You would not make it." And I said, "Are you threatening me?" And it said, "No, we are protecting you." And I said, "From what?" And it pointed to the woods, and I saw something moving in the shadows, and it was big, and it had too many limbs, and I felt my stomach turn. And the hollow one said, "That is what lives out there, and if you leave the town it will find you and we will not stop it." And I said, "Why?" And it said, "Because that is the deal." And I got back in my car, and it started immediately, and I drove back to Gable Creek, and I have not tried to leave since. I have been here for 6 months now, and I've stopped questioning the hollow ones, and I've stopped asking about the deal, and I do my job, and I go home, and I try not to think about what is in the woods. And last week, I responded to a call on the edge of town, and a man said something was trying to get into his house, and I drove out there, and the man was standing on his porch with a shotgun, and I said, "Put the gun down," and he said, "There is something in the yard," and I said, "I will handle it," and he said, "No, you will not, because you do not have a gun." And I said, "I do not need a gun," and he said, "Yes, you do." And he raised the shotgun and pointed it at the woods, and I heard movement, and I turned, and there were hollow ones standing in the trees, and they were just watching, and the man fired into the woods, and the sound echoed, and the hollow ones did not move. And then they turned and walked away, and I said, "What did you do?" And the man said, "I protected myself." And I said, "You broke the deal." And he said, "I do not care." And I said, "You should." And I left. And the next morning I got a call that the man was dead. And I drove out there, and his house was destroyed, and his body was in the yard, and it was torn apart, and there were tracks leading into the woods, and they were not human. And Sergeant Poole said, "This is what happens when you use violence." And I said, "We need to do something." And he said, "There is nothing to do. The deal is the deal." I am recording this because I do not know how much longer I can stay here, and I do not know if I will ever be able to leave, and I need someone to know that there are towns in America where the police do not carry guns, and it is not because of policy. It is because of survival. And if you ever take a job in a small town and they say you cannot be armed, you need to ask why, because some rules are not about safety. They are about sacrifice. And I am sitting in my patrol car right now, and it is midnight, and I am parked on Ridgeline Road, and I can see the hollow ones standing in the trees, and they are watching me, and I think they are waiting for something. I just saw something bigger than them move in the dark, and I think the deal is ending. Before continuing, please take a moment to subscribe the channel. Your support matters a lot. My name is Trevor Madsen, and I was 32 years old when I realized that no one in Harwick ever dies in car accidents, even though we respond to them every single week. And Harwick is a town in southern Idaho with a population of 900, and it sits at the intersection of 2 highways. And we get a lot of traffic and a lot of accidents. And I became a patrol officer there because my wife got a teaching job at the elementary school, and we needed to move. And the department was hiring, and Chief Stillman seemed decent enough, and the pay was fine. And my first week was normal, and I responded to fender benders and a few domestic calls, and I felt like I was settling in. And then I responded to my first serious accident on Highway 93, and it was bad. And a sedan had hit a truck head-on, and both vehicles were totaled, and there was blood on the windshield, and the airbags were deployed. And I called for an ambulance, and I approached the sedan, and I expected to find a body, but the driver was gone. And I checked the truck, and that driver was gone too. And I radioed dispatch and said the drivers are not here, and dispatch said check the area, they might have wandered off. And I searched, and I could not find anyone. and the ambulance arrived, and the paramedics looked confused, and I said, the drivers are missing, and one of them said, this happens. Sometimes people go into shock and walk away, and I said, both of them. And he shrugged and said, I guess. So when we cleared the scene and I filed a report, and I listed both drivers as missing, and I thought that would be the end of it. But then I responded to another accident 3 days later, and the same thing happened, and the vehicles were destroyed, and there was blood but no bodies, and I searched and found nothing. And I went back to the station and I asked Chief Stillman if this was normal, and he said, define normal, and I said, drivers disappearing from accident scenes. And he said, it happens, and I said, how often? And he said, often enough, and I said, we should investigate, and he said, there is nothing to investigate. Trevor, and I said, 2 people are missing, and he said, they are not missing, they just left, and I said, left where? And he looked at me for a long time and said, you will figure it out. I started keeping track of the accidents after that, and over the next 2 months I responded to 11 crashes, and in every single one the vehicles were destroyed, and there was evidence of injury, but the drivers were gone. And I checked the hospitals, and no one matching the descriptions had been admitted. And I checked the morgue, and there were no bodies. And I started asking the other officers, and Deputy Rains said, Trevor, you need to stop looking into this. And I said, why? And he said, because it is not your job. And I said, my job is to investigate. And he said, not this. And I asked if he knew what was happening, and he said, yes. And I said, tell me. And he said, the drivers do not leave Trevor. They are taken. And I said, taken where? And he said, I do not know, but I know we are not supposed to ask. And I said, that is insane. And he said, maybe, but it keeps us employed. And I said, what does that mean? And he said, Harwick needs us to respond to accidents and clean up the scenes and file the reports. And as long as we do that, everything is fine. And I said, fine, for who? And he walked away. I started arriving at accident scenes faster, because I wanted to catch whoever was taking the drivers, and one night I got a call about a crash on Highway 26, and I was only 2 miles away, and I arrived within 3 minutes, and the car was wrapped around a tree, and the front end was destroyed, and I got out and approached, and the driver was still inside, and she was a woman in her 40s, and she was unconscious and bleeding from her head, and I opened the door and checked her pulse, and she was alive, and I radioed for an ambulance, and I turned to get my first aid kit, and when I turned back she was gone, and I stared at the empty seat, and the blood was still there, and the airbag was still deployed, but she was gone, and I looked around and there was no one, and I shouted and no one answered, and I felt panic rising in my chest, and I searched the woods and the road, and I could not find her, and the ambulance arrived, and I told them she was gone, and they did not seem surprised, and I said she was here 30 seconds ago, and one of the paramedics said they always are until they are not, and I said, what does that mean? And he said, it means you should stop asking questions, Trevor. And they left. And I stood there alone, and I knew something was very wrong. I went to Chief Stillman the next day, and I said I saw a woman vanish from a car, and he said, I know. And I said, how do you know? And he said, because I have seen it too. And I said, what is taking them? And he said, I do not know, but I know we are supposed to let it happen. And I said, I cannot do that. And he said, you do not have a choice. And I said, yes, I do. And he said, Trevor, if you interfere, you will regret it. And I said, is that a threat? And he said, no, it is a warning. And I asked what would happen if I tried to stop it. And he said, the officer before you tried to stop it. And I said, what happened to him? And Chief Stillman opened a drawer and pulled out a file, and he slid it across the desk, and I opened it, and inside was a report about an officer named Mark Holloway, who died in a car accident on Highway 93. And I read the report, and it said, his vehicle left the road for no apparent reason and struck a tree, and he was killed instantly. And I looked up at Chief Stillman and said, you are saying he was killed because he interfered? And Chief Stillman said, I am saying he died in an accident, just like everyone else. And I said, no one else dies in accidents in Harwick. And he said, exactly, and I felt my blood run cold. I stopped responding to accidents after that because I was afraid, and I told dispatch I was unavailable, and Deputy Rains started taking all the calls, and I felt like a coward, but I did not know what else to do. And then one night, my wife Sarah was driving home from a parent-teacher conference, and I got a call from dispatch, and the voice said, Trevor, there has been an accident on Highway 26. And I said, "Send someone else." And the voice said, "It is your wife's car." And I felt like I had been punched in the stomach, and I grabbed my keys and I drove faster than I ever had. And I arrived at the scene, and Sarah's car was in the ditch and the front end was smashed, and I jumped out and ran to the car, and she was inside and she was unconscious and bleeding, and I opened the door and I pulled her out and I held her and I said, "Sarah, wake up," and she did not respond, and I laid her on the ground and I started doing CPR, and I heard something behind me and I turned, and there was a man standing there, and he was tall and thin and his face was in shadow, and he said, "You need to let her go." And I said, "No." And he said, "She is already gone." "Trevor," and I said, "She is not dead." And he said, "Not yet, but she will be, and you cannot stop it." And I said, "Watch me." And I kept doing CPR, and he stepped closer and said, "If you do not let her go, then the town will take you instead." And I said, "I do not care." And he said, "You will." And he reached for Sarah, and I grabbed my gun, and I pointed it at him, and I said, "Do not touch her." And he stopped, and he looked at me, and his eyes were black and empty. And he said, "You are making a mistake." And I said, "Get away from her." And he stepped back and he said, "The town will remember this," and he vanished. And I do not mean he walked away. I mean he disappeared like he was never there. And I kept doing CPR, and Sarah gasped and opened her eyes. And I said, "Thank God." And she looked at me and said, "What happened?" And I said, "You were in an accident, but you are okay now." And the ambulance arrived, and they took her to the hospital, and she survived, and I thought I had won. But I was wrong, because the next day I got called into Chief Stillman's office, and he looked angry, and he said, "Trevor, what did you do?" And I said, "I saved my wife." And he said, "You broke the agreement." And I said, "What agreement?" And he said, "The agreement that keeps Harwick safe." And I said, "I do not know what you are talking about." And he said, "The town takes people from accidents, and in exchange, the town protects us from worse things." And I said, "What worse things?" And he said, "Things that would kill all of us." And I said, "That is insane." And he said, "You will see." And I said, "See what?" And he did not answer. And that night, I was on patrol, and I saw something crossing the road, and it was big, and it moved wrong. And I hit the brakes, and it stopped in the middle of the highway and turned to look at me, and it had too many legs, and its head was shaped wrong. And I stared at it, and it stared back, and then it walked into the woods. And I sat there shaking, and I realized Chief Stillman was right, and the town had been protecting us from something, and I had broken the agreement, and now it was coming back. I tried to leave Harwick, but Sarah did not want to because she loved her job, and she said I was being paranoid, and I said, "I am not." And she said, "Then prove it." And I could not, because how do you prove something like that? And I stayed, and every night I saw things on the roads and in the woods, and they were always watching and always waiting. And I responded to another accident 2 weeks later, and the driver was still in the car, and I tried to pull him out, and the man in shadow appeared, and he said, "You cannot save them all, Trevor." And I said, "I can try." And he said, "You already made your choice, and now you have to live with it." And I said, "What does that mean?" And he pointed behind me, and I turned, and there were things standing in the trees, and they were tall and wrong, and I realized they were waiting for me. And the man in shadow said, "The town will take your wife eventually, because the agreement must be kept." And I said, "No." And he said, "Yes. And one day you will come to an accident, and she will be inside, and you will have to choose between her and the town." And I said, "I will choose her." And he said, "Then the town will die, and everyone in it will die, and you will have to live with that." And he vanished, and I stood there alone, and I knew he was right. I have been in Harwick for 11 months now, and I still respond to accidents, and I still watch the drivers disappear, and I do not interfere anymore because I am afraid of what will happen if I do, and Sarah does not know any of this, and I cannot tell her because she would not believe me. And last week I responded to an accident on Highway 93, and I arrived, and I saw Sarah's car, and my heart stopped, and I ran to it, and she was inside, and she was unconscious, and the man in shadow was standing beside the car, and he said, "It is time, Trevor." And I said, "Please do not take her." And he said, "You made your choice, and now the town is making its choice." And I said, "I will do anything." And he said, "Then let her go." And I stood there, and I looked at Sarah, and I thought about everyone in Harwick, and I thought about the things in the woods, and I realized I could not save her, because saving her would kill everyone else. And I stepped back, and the man in shadow reached into the car, and Sarah disappeared, and I fell to my knees, and I screamed. And he said, "You did the right thing, Trevor." And I said, "I hate you." And he said, "I know." And he vanished. And I have not seen Sarah since. And when I go home, her things are still there. But it is like she never existed, and no one in town remembers her except me. I am recording this because I need someone to know what Harwick really is, and if you ever drive through a town where there are never any bodies at accident scenes, you need to keep driving, because some towns have agreements and some agreements require sacrifices, and I am still here because I do not know where else to go, and every night I see the man in shadow watching me, and I know that one day he will come for me too. I just got a call about an accident on Highway 26, and dispatch said the driver looks like me. My name is Beth Kowalski, and I need to tell you about the photograph before they take it away from me, because once it is gone, I will forget just like everyone else. And I was 29 years old when I joined the Coldwater Police Department in eastern Wyoming, and Coldwater was one of those towns you pass through on the way to somewhere else. And I grew up in Chicago working beat patrol, and I was tired of the noise and the violence, and I wanted somewhere I could breathe, and Coldwater seemed perfect because it was small and slow, and the biggest crime they had was kids spray painting the water tower. And I met Lieutenant Voss on my first day, and he was in his 50s with kind eyes and a soft voice, and he showed me around the station and introduced me to the other 3 officers, and everything felt normal until he took me into the back room and showed me the photograph, and it was hanging on the wall in a cheap frame, and it was a black and white photo of Main Street from what looked like the 1950s, and there were people standing on the sidewalk, and they were all looking at the camera, and Lieutenant Voss said, "This is the most important thing in the station." And I laughed because I thought he was joking, but he did not laugh, and he said, "Beth, I need you to listen very carefully." And he said, "Every officer in Coldwater has to check this photograph every day." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because the people in it move." And I stared at him and said, "What?" And he said, "The people in the photograph move, and if we do not check it every day, we will not notice when someone new appears." And I said, "This is a joke." And he said, "I wish it was." And he pointed to a woman in the photograph standing in front of the general store, and he said, 2 weeks ago she was not there." And I said, "Maybe you are remembering it wrong." And he said, "Beth, I have been looking at this photograph every day for 18 years, and I know every face and every detail, and that woman was not there 2 weeks ago, and now she is." And I said, "Where did she come from?" And he said, "We think she is someone who disappeared." I thought Lieutenant Voss was losing his mind, but I did not say that because I needed the job. And he told me to check the photograph every morning when I came in and to report any changes, and I said, "Okay." And I went about my day and I tried to forget about it, but that night I could not stop thinking about the photograph, and I went back to the station after my shift, and I stood in front of it, and I studied every face and every building, and I counted 23 people in the photo, and I took a picture of it with my phone so I could compare it the next day, and when I came in the next morning I checked and everything looked the same, and I felt relieved because I thought maybe Lieutenant Voss was just paranoid. But then on my 3rd day I checked the photograph, and there was a man standing in the background near the hardware store, and I did not remember him being there. And I looked at the picture on my phone, and he was not in it. And I felt my heart start to race. And I went to Lieutenant Voss, and I said, "There is someone new in the photograph." And he came and looked, and he nodded and said, "I see him." And I said, "Who is he?" And Lieutenant Voss pulled out a binder and flipped through it, and he showed me a missing persons report from 1963, and it was a man named Thomas Ehrlich who disappeared while walking home from the bar. And I looked at the report, and then at the photograph, and it was the same man, and I said, "This does not make sense." And Lieutenant Voss said, "Nothing about the photograph makes sense, Beth, but it happens." And I asked how long this had been going on, and he said, "As long as anyone can remember." I started checking the photograph every day, and I started keeping my own log of who was in it and where they were standing, and after 2 weeks another person appeared, and it was a teenage girl standing near the drugstore. And I checked the missing persons reports and found her, and her name was Sandra Pike, and she disappeared in 1978 while riding her bike. And I stared at the photograph and I said to Lieutenant Voss, "How is this possible?" And he said, "We do not know, but we think the town is keeping them." And I said, "Keeping them where?" And he said, "In the photograph." And I said, "That is insane." And he said, "Yes, it is, but it is also true." And I asked if anyone had ever tried to destroy the photograph, and he looked at me like I had said something dangerous, and he said, "We tried once in 1984, and I said, "What happened?" And he said, "The officer who broke the frame died in his sleep that night." And when we checked on him, his body was cold and his eyes were open and his face was frozen in a scream. And we put the photograph back on the wall and no one has touched it since. And I said, "So we are just supposed to watch it?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "What is the point?" And he said, "Because if we stop watching, then we will not know when someone from the present disappears into it." And I said, "Has that ever happened?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "When?" And he said, "Last year." I did not want to ask, but I had to. And I said, "Who?" And Lieutenant Voss said her name was Officer Amy Delgado, and she worked here for 4 years, and one day she did not show up for her shift. And we went to her house, and she was gone. And all her things were still there, and her car was in the driveway, and we searched everywhere, and we could not find her. And then I checked the photograph, and she was in it. And I said, "Show me." And he pointed to a woman standing in front of the post office, and I looked close, and it was definitely a modern woman because her clothes were wrong for the 1950s, and she looked terrified. And I said, "Can we get her out?" And Lieutenant Voss said, "We have tried everything and nothing works." And I said, "What did you try?" And he said, "We tried talking to the photograph, and we tried covering it, and we tried taking it down, and every time we did something happened." And I said, "What kind of something?" And he said, "The town started to change." And I said, "Change how?" And he said, "Buildings that were not there before appeared, and people we did not recognize walked the streets, and we put the photograph back, and everything went back to normal." And I realized the photograph was not just a photograph, it was an anchor, and it was holding cold water in place. I became obsessed with the photograph, and I started staying late at the station just to stare at it, and I started to notice things I had not noticed before, like the way the shadows fell wrong, and the way some of the people's faces were blurred, and the way the sky in the photograph was a color that did not exist. And I started having dreams where I was inside the photograph walking down Main Street, and everyone was frozen except me. And I would try to talk to them, but they would not move, and I would try to leave, but the street went on forever, and I would wake up sweating and gasping. And I started to wonder if checking the photograph every day was making me part of it. And I asked Lieutenant Voss, and he said, "Maybe." And I said, "Have you ever felt like you were being pulled in?" And he said, "Every day." And I said, "Why do you keep doing it?" And he said, "Because if I stop, then someone else has to. And I would rather it be me than someone who does not understand." And I said, "Understand what?" And he said that Coldwater is not a real town, it is a memory, and the photograph is what is remembering it. And I said, "Whose memory?" And he said, "I do not know, but whoever it is, they are still watching." One morning I came into the station, and the photograph was different, and I do not mean there was a new person. I mean the entire photograph had changed, and it was no longer Main Street in the 1950s. It was Main Street now, and I was in it, and I was standing in front of the station in my uniform, and I stared at it, and I felt cold all over. And I called Lieutenant Voss, and he came running, and he looked at the photograph, and his face went white, and he said, "Beth, you need to leave Coldwater right now." And I said, "What?" And he said, "The photograph is taking you, and once you are fully in it, you will not be able to leave." And I said, "I am already in it." And he said, "No, you're being pulled in, and there is still time." And I said, "Time for what?" And he said, "Time to run." And I turned to leave, but the door would not open, and I pulled, and it was locked. And Lieutenant Voss tried his key, and it did not work. And we both turned and looked at the photograph, and I was closer to the camera now, and I could see my face more clearly, and I was smiling, but I was not smiling in real life. And Lieutenant Voss said, "Beth, do not look at it." And I said, "I cannot stop." And he grabbed my shoulders and turned me around and said, "Focus on me." And I tried, but I could feel the photograph pulling at me, and I could feel myself fading, and I looked down at my hands and they were starting to blur. And Lieutenant Voss said, "No, no, no." And he dragged me out of the room and into the main office, and the other officers were staring, and he said, "Get her out of the building." And they grabbed me and pulled me toward the door. And it opened this time, and they shoved me outside, and I fell onto the pavement, and I gasped and looked at my hands, and they were solid again. And I looked back at the station, and Lieutenant Voss was standing in the doorway, and he said, "Do not come back." "Beth," and I said, "What about you?" And he said, "I will keep watching." And I said, "For how long?" And he said, "Until it takes me to." And he closed the door. I got in my car and I tried to drive out of cold water, but I could not because every road I took led me back to Main Street, and I tried again and again and I could not leave. And I realized the town was not going to let me go because I was already part of the photograph and it did not matter if I was inside the station or not. And I went to my apartment and I looked in the mirror and I saw myself, but I also saw the photograph behind me reflected in the glass, and I was in it standing on the sidewalk, and I closed my eyes, and when I opened them it was gone, but I knew it was still there. And that night I dreamed I was walking through the photograph and everyone was moving now, and they were all looking at me and they said, "Welcome, Beth." And I said, "I do not want to be here." And they said, "None of us did, but here we are." And I asked how to leave, and they said, "You cannot leave once the town remembers you." And I woke up and I knew it was true. I have been in cold water for 7 months now, and I do not go to the station anymore because I am afraid of what I will see in the photograph. And Lieutenant Voss calls me sometimes and tells me who has appeared. And last week he said, "Beth, you are in it again." And I said, "Where?" And he said, "You are standing in front of the diner and you are looking at the camera." And I asked if I look scared, and he said, "No, you look like you belong." And I said, "I do not belong." And he said, "The photograph thinks you do." And I asked when it would take me completely. And he said, "I do not know, but it is getting closer." And I said, "How do you know?" And he said, "Because I can barely see you anymore when you are standing in front of me." And I looked down at my hands, and they were faint, like I was disappearing. And I asked if there was anything I could do. And he said, "No, Beth, there is nothing. And I am sorry." And the line went dead, and I sat there alone. And I realized I was becoming part of something I did not understand, and that I would spend the rest of my existence frozen on a sidewalk in a photograph that no one could explain. I went back to the station this morning, and I stood in front of the photograph, and I was in the center now, and I was looking directly at the camera, and my mouth was open like I was screaming, but no sound was coming out. My name is Jason Pruitt, and I was 25 years old when I found the box of incident reports in the basement of the Ember Ridge police station, and I wish I had never opened it because some things should stay buried, and Ember Ridge is in northern Nevada, and the population is around 500. And I took the job as a deputy because I grew up nearby, and I knew the area, and Chief Waller hired me on the spot because they were short-staffed, and my first 2 weeks were quiet, and I did filing and rode along with Deputy Hess, and learned the town, and everything seemed normal until Chief Waller asked me to clean out the basement because it was full of old files and equipment and no one had been down there in years. And I said sure, and I went down there with a flashlight because the lights did not work, and the basement was huge and it was filled with boxes and filing cabinets and old uniforms, and I started going through everything and most of it was junk. But then I found a box in the corner and it was labeled Incident Reports 1952 to 1979 Do Not Remove, and I opened it and inside were hundreds of reports, and I started reading them and my stomach turned because every single report described the same thing, and they all said that someone in Ember Ridge had reported hearing knocking on their door at night, and when they answered, no one was there. And at first I thought it was just kids playing pranks, but as I kept reading I realized it was not pranks because the report said that after the knocking started, people began to disappear. And I found a report from 1957 where a woman named Clara Finch reported knocking on her door every night for a week, and she called the police every time, and every time they checked and no one was there. And then one night she did not call, and the next morning her neighbor found her door open, and Clara was gone, and they searched her house and everything was in place, and there was no sign of struggle, and she was never found. And I kept reading, and I found more reports just like it, and every single one ended with someone disappearing, and I counted, and there were 38 people who vanished after hearing the knocking. I took the box upstairs, and I went to Chief Waller, and I said I found these reports in the basement, and I need to know what this is about. And he looked at the box, and his face went white, and he said, "Where did you find that?" And I said, "In the corner." And he said that box was supposed to be destroyed. And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because it is not something we talk about." And I said, 38 people disappeared, and he said, "I know." And I said, "We need to investigate." And he said, "It is too late." And I said, "What does that mean?" And he said, "The knocking never stopped, Jason." And I said, "What?" And he said, The knocking has been happening since the town was founded, and people still disappear, and we just do not write reports anymore. And I said, why not? And he said, because there is nothing we can do. And I said, that is insane. And he said, welcome to Ember Ridge. And I asked if he had ever heard the knocking, and he said, yes. And I said, what did you do? And he said, I did not answer the door. I could not stop thinking about the reports, and I started asking people in town if they had ever heard knocking at night, and most of them would not talk to me. But an old man named Earl, who lived on the edge of town, said he had heard it. And I asked what it sounded like, and he said it sounded like someone knocking with their knuckles, slow and deliberate, and it would go on for hours. And I asked if he ever answered, and he said once. And I said what happened, and he said no one was there, but I felt something. And I said, felt what? And he said, I felt like I was being watched, and I felt cold. And I went back inside, and the knocking stopped, and I asked if it ever came back, and he said yes, every few years. And I said, what do you do? And he said, I do not answer. And I asked if he knew anyone who disappeared. And he said, my wife and I stared at him, and he said she answered the door in 1983, and I never saw her again. And I said, I am sorry. And he said, it is what it is, and he told me to leave. I started staying up at night listening, and on my fourth night in Ember Ridge I heard it, and it was 1 a.m., and I was lying in bed, and I heard knocking on my front door, and it was slow and rhythmic, and I got up, and I looked through the peephole, and no one was there, and the knocking continued, and I felt my heart pounding, and I unlocked the door, and I opened it, and there was no one on my porch, and I stepped outside, and the knocking stopped, and I looked around, and the street was empty, and it was silent, and I went back inside, and I locked the door, and I sat on the couch, and I waited. And at 1:15, the knocking started again, and this time it was louder, and I ignored it, and it went on for an hour, and then it stopped, and I did not sleep that night. And the next morning I went to the station, and I told Chief Waller that I heard the knocking, and he said, I know. And I said, how do you know? And he said, because everyone hears it eventually. And I said, what is doing it? And he said, we do not know, but we know it is connected to the disappearances. And I said, we need to stop it. And he said, we have tried. And I said, what did you try? And he said, everything, and nothing works. I decided to stay awake and watch my door the next time I heard the knocking, and it happened again 2 nights later, and this time I set up a camera facing the front door, and I sat in my living room and I waited, and at 1 a.m., the knocking started, and I looked at the camera feed and there was no one there. But the knocking continued, and I grabbed my flashlight and I opened the door, and the knocking stopped, and I looked at the camera footage and I rewound it, and I watched the moment the knocking started, and I saw something, and it was not a person. It was a shadow, and it moved across my porch, and it stopped in front of the door, and it raised its hand and knocked, and I could see the shadow, but I could not see what was casting it, and I felt cold all over, and I watched as it knocked again and again, and then it stopped, and it turned, and looked at the camera, and I saw 2 eyes in the shadow, and they were white and empty, and I stopped the footage and I sat there shaking, and I realized that whatever was knocking was not human, and it was not alive. I showed the footage to Chief Waller, and he watched it, and he said, I told you, we do not talk about this. And I said, we have proof now. And he said, proof of what, Jason? That there is a shadow knocking on doors. And I said, yes. And he said, and what are we supposed to do about it? And I said, we find out what it wants. And he said, it wants to take people. And I said, why? And he said, we do not know, but we know it has been doing it for over 100 years, and we cannot stop it. And I said, there has to be a way. And he said, if there is, we have not found it. And he told me to destroy the footage, and I said no. And he said, Jason, if you keep digging, you will end up like the others. And I said, what others? And he said, the officers who tried to stop it. And I said, what happened to them? And he said, they disappeared. And I said, after they heard the knocking. And he nodded, and I felt my stomach drop. I heard the knocking every night after that, and it got louder and more insistent, and I stopped answering the door, and I stopped looking at the camera, and I just sat in my living room with the lights on, and I waited for it to stop, and it would go on for hours, and then it would stop, and I would try to sleep, but I could not, because I kept thinking about the shadow in the eyes. And one night the knocking was so loud that I thought the door would break, and I covered my ears and I screamed for it to stop, and it did not stop. And then I heard glass breaking, and I looked, and the window next to the door was shattered, and I saw a hand reaching through, and it was pale and thin, and the fingers were too long. And I ran to my bedroom, and I locked the door, and I called Chief Waller, and I said, it is inside my house. And he said, do not let it see you. And I said, what? And he said, if it sees you, it will take you. And I said, it already saw me. And he was silent. And then he said, "I am sorry, Jason." And he hung up, and I sat there in the dark, and I heard footsteps in my hallway, and I heard the doorknob turning, and I closed my eyes, and I prayed. And the footsteps stopped, and I waited. And after a long time, I opened my eyes, and it was morning. And I unlocked the door, and the hallway was empty, and the window was not broken. And I thought maybe I had dreamed it, but when I looked at my front door, there were scratches on the inside like something had been trying to get out. I tried to leave Ember Ridge after that, and I packed my things, and I got in my car, and I drove, and I got to the edge of town, and I saw a figure standing in the road, and it was the shadow, and I could see it in the daylight now, and it was tall and thin, and it had no face, and it raised its hand and pointed at me, and I felt cold, and I turned the car around, and I drove back, and I have not tried to leave since, and I have been here for 4 months now, and the knocking happens every night, and I do not answer, and I do not look, and I just wait for it to stop. And last week, Deputy Hess did not show up for work, and Chief Waller said he quit, but I went to his house, and his car was there, and his door was open, and there were scratches on the inside of the door, and I knew he did not quit, and I knew he was gone. And Chief Waller told me to stop asking, and I have stopped asking, but I know I am next, because the knocking is getting louder, and last night it did not stop, and it went on until dawn, and I think it is running out of patience. I am recording this because someone needs to know what happens in Ember Ridge. And if you ever move to a small town and people tell you not to answer your door at night, you need to listen, because some things knock, and some things wait, and some things take. And I do not think I have much time left. The knocking just started again, and it is only 3 in the afternoon. And those were 5 small-town cops' horror stories. Reminders that sometimes the most frightening authority isn't hiding in the shadows. It's standing under flashing lights, telling you everything's fine. If stories like this keep you watching past midnight, subscribe to Dark Hours for more true horror, disturbing encounters, and real stories that don't make the news. And let me know in the comments, which story unsettled you the most. Until next time, stay alert, trust your instincts. And if you ever see lights in your rear view mirror in the middle of nowhere, hope they're there to help.